Have you ever found yourself pleading with the universe for a clear sign about money, while opportunities knock at your door and you ignore them? I have watched this exact scene play out so many times that I stopped calling it coincidence. This behavior is a pattern. It's a relationship people build with the idea of the universe, and that relationship often turns toxic. They tell themselves they are tuned in or spiritually advanced. They speak about messages and timing with a kind of reverence. But when the rubber meets the road, they are frozen. They wait for an unambiguous sign. They call their paralysis intuition. I call it fear wearing a robe. What I am going to do here is not gossip. This is a clinical reading. I will expose the filters the mind builds when it learns to expect magic. I will show how those filters ignore the practical evidence life hands you. I will trace how a demand for signs creates a habitual retreat from decision-making. Most important, I will link that retreat to the slow, steady poverty many of these people call fate. This is not a moralizing rant. It is a diagnosis with a route out. I will also give a clear, small set of practices that rewire the habit. So ask yourself plainly, are you abandoning the real while chasing ethereal confirmations? In the next section, I will cut open that self-image and show the truth beneath the phrases people use to feel superior. What they say and what they do are two different worlds. I will show both, and then I will show the subtypes of how this pattern dresses itself up. Stay with me. The picture gets sharper. That opening scene looks innocent, but it hides a recurring architecture of thought. When someone begs for signs instead of making choices, a set of habits is already operating. I say habits because this is not a one-off. This is a rehearsed loop. It begins with a self-image that sounds noble. They see themselves as spiritually awake, morally purer than people who chase money. They talk about alignment, surrender, and waiting for higher guidance. To the outsider, it sounds elevated. To me, it looks like a defensive story. They tell others that they are on a different timeline. They announce they will not compromise the soul for cash. They quote vague principles about detachment and trust. In social circles, they get applause for refusing dishonest deals. Those statements are performances that protect a deeper fear. Behind the language of purity is the private story. I am not competent enough to handle risk without divine certainty. That story is the real engine. Privately, their inner voice is less spiritual. It whispers, if I act and fail, I will be exposed. So they invent spiritual criteria that justify inaction. They browse online rituals, check for repeating numbers, wait for a dream with clear instruction. Each ritual gives a temporary relief from anxiety. The relief is like a drug. It quiets the judgmental inner voice for a few hours. But it does not change the circumstance. When money touches reality, their behavior tells the truth about them more than any spiritual slogan. Offered a partnership, they ask for a sign. Offered a job, they delay the application while they listen. Given a chance to learn about investing, they prefer rituals over research. When a quick decision could yield a small win, they stall until the moment passes. The result is always the same. Missed openings, deferred experiments, and an accumulation of small losses that look like bad luck from the outside. I watch how they respond to money in concrete moments. Someone gets a 10% raise. Instead of negotiating or planning, they feel guilty. They postpone action with sentences like, I want to be sure this is aligned. Another person receives an unexpected $2,000 payment. They spend it impulsively in a way that feels right, and later claim they were guided, even when the choice worsened their budget. In conversations about success, their tone can be a mix of moral superiority and resentment. They admire people who act, but they also secretly accuse them of selling out. That contradiction eats at them. That gap between what they say and what they do is not random. It is coherent with a single organizing fear of responsibility. If the universe decides, you are not accountable. If you decide and fail, the failure is yours to carry. So the mind invents rules where action must be sanctioned by cosmic proof. That rule functions as a shield. It protects the ego from judgment and preserves a fragile identity that believes it is different. Let me give you a day in the life scene I see often. A woman wakes at 7 a.m. She scrolls feeds for validation. At 9 a.m., an acquaintance texts about a small freelance gig that pays $1,200. She feels interest. Her first thought is, I'll check if this is the right thing. 2 hours later, she notices repeating numbers on the clock. She reads a message she interprets as a sign. The job poster already hired someone. She tells herself, if it was meant for me, it would have waited. Then she spends the rest of the day consoling herself with spiritual reading. That same freelancer had the skill to do the job and would have earned useful momentum. But the momentum never started. Another scene. A man is offered a chance to join a startup team. He sits with the documents for a week. He wants clarity. He hires a reader, books a meditation retreat, and waits for an epiphany. While he searches for confirmation, the opportunity closes. He later says, the universe saved me from a bad match. He never knows whether the deal was good or bad because he never investigated. The absence of data becomes proof. These behaviors mirror a pattern of avoidance. The person substitutes symbolic actions for concrete evaluation. They gather evidence in the form of coincidences. They treat comfort as the primary sign. If a potential choice promises growth but also discomfort, they feel certain the universe is against it. Conversely, anything that is easy is read as a green light. That is a lethal heuristic for financial life. Prosperity rarely comes wrapped in ease. Now, I want to say something practical and human. If you are listening and you feel targeted, that is normal. I have seen this pattern in myself at times. I am not here to shame. I am here to name. Naming brings freedom. If you are nodding along, understand this. The mind will rationalize to avoid responsibility, and it will always find spiritual language to do it. The only antidote is simple, clarity and a small accountability system. But before I give tools, I need to map the internal types inside this tribe. Each type wears the same fear differently. Recognizing your subtype is the first act of honesty. A brief pause here. If you have found this analysis useful, I want to ask something small. I'm building a community that examines these patterns openly. If you are watching, please consider subscribing to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Also leave a comment with your city and country so I can see where this conversation matters. That support helps me keep making these deep, honest videos. Thank you. Back to the diagnosis. There are at least 4 faces of this pattern. Each face hides its own rationalizations and produces predictable consequences. The first face is the person who literally cannot move without an unmistakable sign. Their life accumulates postponed choices. The second face uses the cosmic timeline as a clever excuse to procrastinate and never risk. The third face is selective. They only see signals that confirm their comforts and avoid anything that requires effort. The fourth face makes waiting itself a spiritual badge. They collect knowledge and rituals, but remain impotent in real-world situations. All 4 share an essential contradiction. They proclaim a higher connection to the universe while refusing the daily work required to transform conditions. They idolize inner states and neglect outer evidence. That contradiction produces a unique kind of spiritual poverty. It feels noble and tragic at the same time. And then the world responds exactly to what they practice. Less responsibility, less agency, and fewer results. In the next section, I will flesh these subtypes in cinematic detail. You will see scenes so clear you may find yourself in one of them. Which one are you? I will help you identify it next. These subtypes are variations on the same theme. Fear dressed as spirituality. I want to describe each one so precisely you recognize the pattern in your own decisions. I will walk through a day in their lives, name the belief that drives them, and show the real cost they pay. This is not to blame. It is to map the road so you can choose a different direction. The first type I call the paralyzed by signs. They believe that unless a confirmation is obvious and undeniable, they must not act. The armor feels righteous, but it also stiffens them. Opportunities that require quick moves seed clients, fast hires, early investments slip through their fingers. They often end up on the outside watching others harvest the momentum they could have had. The real cost? Time. Time compounds. Missed early windows are rarely recoverable. The third type is the selective interpreter. This one is sly. They will find signals to justify whatever they already want. Their day looks like confirmation bias in action. They hear what aligns with their wish and ignore everything that contradicts it. If a venture demands hard work, they claim the universe is pointing them away. If an easy shortcut appears, they call it alignment. Their core belief says, "The universe shows me the most comfortable path." They mistake comfort for guidance. The danger here is not passivity, it's distortion. They can be highly active, but their activity is shaped to prove a story, not to test reality. The result is busy work that often leads nowhere or to shallow outcomes. The fourth type is the professional waiter. Waiting is their identity. They have an arsenal: courses, retreats, rituals, certifications. They are always preparing. A typical day includes learning, practicing ritual, and planning, but very little execution. Their belief: I must be fully ready before the great opportunity can arrive. The problem is their readiness is a moving target. Every new skill becomes a reason to delay action. Years pass with steady accumulation of knowledge and little application. They feel safe in perpetual readiness, but the world rewards those who act imperfectly. The cost here is a life of near-miss mastery and a chronic sense of being almost there. Across these four faces there is a shared kernel, the transfer of responsibility. They are, in effect, outsourcing choice to an imagined cosmic authority. That move reduces immediate anxiety. It feels like humility and trust, but it also removes practice. Responsibility is a muscle. The more you hand it away, the weaker it becomes. Each subtype weakens that muscle in a different way: paralysis through fear, procrastination through timing, distortion through selective reading, and avoidance through endless preparation. I want to show two human stories because stories make the diagnosis live. The first is Anna. She was a paralyzed by signs type. Anna had a steady but small studio where she taught classes. A collector offered to feature her work in a group show with potential buyers. Anna waited for a sign. Weeks passed. She interpreted a dozen small coincidences as reasons to delay. The show hired someone else. Anna later told friends, "The universe protected me." But the protection never showed as a different opportunity. Instead, Anna lost the sales, the exposure, and the confidence that comes from trying. A year later, she had fewer leads and more rituals. The pattern had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The second story is of Marco, the professional waiter. Marco spent 5 years taking workshops, certifications, and trainings. He amassed impressive credentials, but kept saying, "Next month I'll launch." He believed the right moment required more polishing. One day a peer launched with fewer qualifications and found a market. Clients multiplied. Marco's waiting had become his alibi. He told himself he valued depth over haste. The world responded by rewarding action. Marco eventually felt rage and shame toward his peers, who looked less prepared, but had real momentum. He had all the knowledge and none of the practice. Both stories show how the pattern weaponizes self-image. The person can appear noble, thoughtful, even disciplined. Yet the result is stagnation. The spirituality becomes a veneer for a fragile ego that fears being judged as incompetent. And here is the hard mirror. Many listeners will recognize themselves across several of these types. It is common to slide between them. You might be selective in one area of your life and paralyzed in another. So what ties these types together beyond fear? It is a specific belief system about control and blame. They assume that if the universe must give a sign, then responsibility will be shared. If they act and fail, blame falls squarely on them. If a sign came and they failed anyway, They can blame the sign for being ambiguous. It is an intellectual escape route from the hard work of consequence bearing. The universe becomes a scapegoat. Now, notice what this does to the field of opportunity. The patterns we've described do not exist in a vacuum. Reality answers consistent behaviors. If you habitually refuse responsibility, you send signals into your environment: nonverbal, behavioral, energetic. People notice. Opportunities adapt. Offers arrive that match your capacity for risk. In many cases, that means less advantageous offers. The world mirrors the level of responsibility you practice. It is not mystical punishment. It is simple ecology. At the end of this mapping, you should feel two things. 1. A clarity about how your private rituals might be costing you financial and practical consequences. 2. A blunt invitation. This is changeable. Knowing your subtype gives you a tactical advantage. It allows you to pick small, targeted interventions that address the exact error you make. The interventions differ for the paralyzed, the procrastinator, the selective interpreter, and the professional waiter. But they all require one shared act: reclaiming a sliver of responsibility and testing it immediately. In the next part, 1 will show the invisible law that explains why these patterns always produce the same result. I will name the mechanism that translates avoidance into scarcity. That law is not moral, it is procedural. Understand it, and you stop misreading the world as punishment. I will also begin to show the first exercises to rewire the system. Are you ready to see how responsibility maps to abundance? That is where we go next. I want to take the map I already drew and expose the mechanism behind it. I called it before a law. Now I name it. I call it the law of transfer of responsibility. It sounds formal because it is a pattern. It is not mystical. It is mechanical. It explains why the same spiritual talk produces the same material result. The law is simple in shape. When you hand decision over to an external authority, real or imagine, you also hand over the power to shape outcomes. If you require a sign to move, you are outsourcing choice. You also outsource practice. That is the costly exchange. It feels like protection. It feels humble. But it is a transfer of capability, not an act of faith. I see the law in tiny daily moves. Someone waits for a dream to approve a pitch. Another postpones an email until a number repeats on the clock. Each ritual buys relief. That relief is immediate and believable. It soothes the chest. It reduces the nausea of risk. The price is delayed. The delay compounds into absence. Let me lay out the mechanism in an exact chain you can follow. An event occurs. A job offer arrives. A client asks for a meeting. A neighbor mentions an unpaid invoice. Your mind interprets the event through a default script. That interpretation births an emotion. The emotion shapes the choice you make. The choice produces a result in the world. The result then becomes evidence for the original script. The loop repeats. I will name each link in plain language. Stimulus, meaning, feeling, action, outcome, proof. Stimulus is neutral. Meaning is a story your mind tells to reduce uncertainty. Feeling is the physiological consequence of that story. Action is the visible behavior. Outcome is the reality you live with after that behavior. Proof is your afterwards rhetoric. The law operates because the meaning stage is habitually outsourced to myth instead of tested against facts. Here is how it looks when the script is spiritualized. Stimulus. An investor texts about early funding. Meaning, if this is for me, the universe will confirm. Feeling, relief if you wait, anxiety to decide. Action, defer, seek confirmation, perform ritual. Outcome, funding window passes. Proof, it was not for me. The script survives. The law executed itself. What I want you to feel is the brutal coherence of this process. Nothing magical happened. There was a momentum that required a nudge. The nudge did not arrive because you removed yourself from the role of nudger. You appointed the cosmos as gatekeeper. The cosmos answered in the only way it could. It mirrored your practice. You practiced avoidance. The cosmos returned avoidance, shaped as mischances. This law works because the world is feedback. It is not a conscious being. The mind prefers to be judged as guided than as incompetent. If a decision fails in the name of divine will, you can avoid personal blame. That is the hidden trait. So the script invents rituals that create cover stories. This is not only about ego. It interacts with shame, with cultural narratives, and with early conditioning. Many people in my life who follow this pattern received messages in childhood that mistakes were catastrophic, or they were idolized for moral purity, or they were punished for ambition. The mind learns the survival strategy: avoid stakes. Spiritual language is a perfect camouflage for that avoidance. Now, how does this law play in money? Money is tangible evidence. It is a scoreboard. Opportunity is often time-sensitive. Delays cost money. Small choices compound into financial identity. When you mount your life on the habit of waiting for a sign, your wealth trajectory stalls. Accounts remain thin. Investments are postponed. Promotions slip away. I will walk you through a layered example. A client offers a contract for $1,200. A person in this tribe becomes interested. The mind whispers, "Wait for guidance." Hours pass. The person checks numerology sites. They notice a repeating number on the clock and interpret it as a signal to wait. The client hires someone else. Later the person tells friends, "If it was meant to be, it would have waited." The loss is now turned into a protective myth. The law did its work. This is why I reject the cultural shorthand that calls this being spiritual. Spirituality can be humility and action. But here the label is performing a defensive function. It performs virtue while functioning as escape. The law of transfer of responsibility explains how that performance becomes practical poverty. You may ask if there is ever a place for signs. Yes, humans sometimes get intuitive nudges. Intuition is real. But intuition and ritual are not the same. Intuition is fast pattern recognition shaped by experience. Rituals that replace assessment are not intuition. The law helps you see the difference. Intuition should sit on a base of competence and evidence. Ritual should not be a substitute for those things. So what strengthens this law? Two things mostly. First, social feedback that rewards the performance. If your social circle applauds your moral stance of waiting, you get social currency for staying small. Second, sporadic coincidences that look like validation. A sign will sometimes appear. That rare confirmation functions as reinforcement. You get intermittent reward. Intermittent schedules are the most addictive. I want you to see how this looks from the inside. Imagine the immediate relief you get when you decide to wait. Anxiety drops. You can sleep. You can feel incorruptibly pure. That relief is rewarding. The brain learns this pattern. It repeats it. Over time, the pattern becomes default. You will automatically search for a sign at critical moments. You will prefer the quiet of ritual to the noise of responsibility. Now consider how the world readjusts. People who notice your reluctance stop offering the high-risk, high-reward things. They will include you in safer opportunities. They will propose roles where indecision is acceptable. That is an ecology responding to your behavior. You send a signal of low appetite for risk. The field matches it with lower stakes. The economy you live in shrinks to fit your tolerance. This law is not a moral condemnation. It is a diagnostic. I am not here to shame. I am naming a structural cause. Naming matters because names allow interventions. And interventions work when they are targeted at the precise step in the chain. If your problem is fear, therapy helps. If your problem is competence, practice helps. If your problem is ritualized avoidance, a different set of practices helps. Let me give you two brief stories that embody this law. The first is Nora. Nora considered herself a channel. She refused to negotiate fees unless she felt energetic alignment with the client. Years passed with small, inconsistent assignments. A colleague, less soulful but more pragmatic, negotiated higher rates and built a stable practice. Nora interpreted the colleague's success as moral compromise. She kept waiting. The law slowly shrank what came to her. The second story is David. David loved learning about spiritual systems. He collected certificates. He read for years. He never launched a course. When a real opportunity to teach in person arrived, he hesitated, asking for confirmation. The window closed. David later blamed timing and said the universe wasn't ready. His bookshelf of knowledge became a monument to his avoidance. The law had translated preparedness into stasis. Both stories show the core move. The person uses spiritual language to shelter from accountability. They transfer the cost of choice to an abstract force. The world reacts as if the person had said, "I am not practicing responsibility." The world responds with less responsibility offered back. This reciprocal shaping is the law of transfer of responsibility in action. Knowing the law should change how you listen to yourself. When you feel the urge to wait for a sign, ask, "Am I avoiding risk or honoring wisdom?" You can test the difference with a short exercise. Before you consult any external ritual, list 3 facts about the opportunity. Then list 1 small action you can take now to test the waters. If you find you cannot identify an evidence-based test, you are likely performing avoidance. There is another important consequence of this law. It produces a peculiar relationship with failure. If a decision is framed as divinely guided, failure is externalized. If it fails, the story says either the sign was misunderstood or the universe changed its mind. Either way, you avoid owning the mistake. That avoidance prevents learning. True competence comes from iterated failure and correction. The law interrupts that feedback loop. Finally, this law explains why the same spiritual script appears across social classes and regions. It is not about doctrine. It is a psychological economy. People with different vocabularies create the same behavioral hedge against responsibility. The cultural outer layers differ. The core calculus is identical. The law is universal because the underlying fears are universal. Understanding the law gives you leverage. When you see the chain, you can intervene at the meaning stage. You can choose a meaning that invites action. You can adopt rituals that require experiments rather than excuses. You can make waiting conditional, not absolute. You can practice small acts of decision under uncertainty. You can train the responsibility muscle. But one warning remains. Understanding the law does not automatically break it. Insight alone rarely rewires habit. Habits require repeated practice and environmental change. You must design small tests that force responsibility. The law will not undo itself. It will be resisted by the comfort it offers. In the next section, I will show exactly how this pattern runs on repeat. I will walk through the full cycle of auto-sabotage so you can see the law operating like clockwork. That is the part where the problem stops feeling abstract and begins to feel urgent. Are you ready to see the loop in action? If you understood the law I just described, you are ready to watch it spin. The cycle of auto-sabotage is where the law reveals its cruelty. It looks almost theatrical when it plays fully. It is the same sequence over and over. The stage changes. The script repeats. The loop opens with opportunity. It is always small at first. A message arrives. A contract appears. A friend proposes collaboration. The mind immediately evaluates risk. That evaluation is heavily biased by past conditioning. If you have practiced transferring responsibility, the assessment slides toward a single conclusion. Wait. You feel the old twinge. It is familiar. You call it humility. You call it surrender. You call it respect for timing. Those are noble words. But here they function as reasoning that cuts off inquiry. You begin looking for signs that will allow you to stay safe. I will break the loop into clear beats so you can see how it reconstructs itself every time. First beat, activation. Something external stimulates you. Second beat, default interpretation. You tell a story. Third beat, safety emotion. Your body relaxes because the story offers escape. Fourth beat, ritual search. You perform symbolic acts. Fifth beat, delay. The opportunity window shrinks. Sixth beat, absence outcome. You interpret the missing result as proof. The loop closes. Now watch it in a money context. A client emails about freelance work worth $1,200. Activation. Let me tell you a concrete sequence that is common in my observation. A person notices someone in their network got a contract. They feel envy. The next opportunity arrives for them. Their first impulse is not to act. They tell themselves they will wait for confirmation. Days pass. They do research but avoid commitment. They lose the chance. Later, they tell themselves the chance was not aligned. Envy remains, but now decorated in virtue. The loop held its logic and produced another year of inertia. One of the cruel things about this loop is that it prevents data gathering. You cannot learn from what you do not try. Each attempt, whether it fails or succeeds, gives information. Waiting eliminates experiments. Without experiments, the mind invents explanations to avoid confronting competence gaps. The explanations always favor the identity you wish to preserve. Noble, patient, spiritually guided. The loop also rewires how others see you. When you habitually delay, people stop trusting your timing. Proposals arrive in forms that favor quick action. People with velocity get the early wins. The social economy rewards speed. You train a social ecology that tolerates your slowness by giving you safer, smaller offers. That is feedback. It is the market speaking. There is a psychological twist that makes the loop sticky. It is called motivated reasoning. Once you adopt a self-image, I refuse to sell out. Your mind will only press facts that fit that image. Disconfirming evidence is reinterpreted. If a risk pays off for someone else, you call it luck or a compromise. If it fails, you say, "See, I was right to wait." The loop protects identity at the cost of growth. I want to be concrete with examples from investment behavior. You see a stock that made a clear move. A friend invests and earns 20% in weeks. You wait for energetic confirmation. Months later, the opportunity evaporates or becomes more volatile. You missed the momentum. You rationalize this by saying you avoided risk. The money you could have made becomes a moral footnote. The loop protected your image, but your balance sheet suffers. There is a social story too. In social circles, you present your waiting as moral superiority. You speak about detachment. People applaud. That applause becomes reward. The loop is socialized. It thrives on admiration. You can lose financially and still receive social praise for the very behavior that produced the loss. That feedback structure is a perfect reinforcement of the loop. Another face of the cycle is selective confirmation. You notice only the signs that validate your decision. You ignore the times when action would have yielded a win. Your perception of frequency skews. The past becomes curated memory. The loop grows stronger because your evidence pool is filtered. At the same time, there is an undercurrent of resentment. You watch others act and succeed. You admire them. Then you quietly judge them for selling out. That resentment is a defensive move. It allows you to stay in place while feeling morally superior. Resentment is the emotional fuel that keeps the loop comfortable. It justifies an action. The financial consequences are concrete and measurable. Missed raises. Unapplied for jobs. Fewer clients. Stalled business growth. These are not metaphors. They are line items. The loop creates a trajectory where income growth is flattened. Savings remain low. Investment knowledge remains theoretical. Debt accumulates. The life you could have built with incremental risks becomes an inventory of near misses. I also need to mention how crises interact with the loop. A crisis will sometimes jolt people out of habit. I have seen two paths after a crisis. Some double down on waiting. They pray more, ritualize more, hoping for a miracle. Others see the arithmetic of scarcity and decide to act differently. The difference is willingness to own responsibility. The crisis exposes the loop. It forces a choice. I should tell you a story of the crisis type. Maya had saved little. She told herself faith would provide. When her landlord increased rent, she panicked. She tried to wait for a sign about taking a second job. The sign never came. A friend pushed her to apply for 2 shifts a week. She resisted initially. She eventually took the shifts and then felt ashamed she had not thought of it earlier. The action solved an immediate problem and began to weaken the loop. That was a moment of learning through doing. Contrast Maya with Lucas. Lucas waited for a perfect new client. He spent months on rituals. When an emergency expense arrived, his savings were insufficient. He blamed timing and cosmic interference. The emergency deepened his debt and his conviction that he had been protected by the universe from something worse. That narrative kept him in the loop. The crisis tightened the pattern, not broke it. I need to be clear about one thing. The loop is not only psychological. It is behavioral and social. You need to displace it at each level. Stopping the loop requires 3 moves: cognitive reframing, small behavioral experiments, and social recalibration. Reframing weakens the meaning link. Experiments break the habit link. Recalibration changes the feedback you receive from others. Before I offer the practical moves, I will show one more stage of the loop. After repetition, the loop becomes identity. You no longer merely wait. You are a person who waits. That identity is defended with new rituals. You will create a mythology around your waiting. It becomes your sacred story. The problem with identity-level loops is they resist insight. You can understand the mechanics and still cling to the identity because it offers you psychological safety. Breaking identity-level loops requires replacing them with a new identity. That is why small experiments matter. They are identity tests. When you do the small act of responsibility and survive, you gather data that you can use to craft a new story about who you are. Action becomes evidence for a different self. I promised earlier to show how the loop becomes a coherent ecology. It matters that you now see the loop in multiple contexts. It is the same pattern in relationships, in investments, in career moves, and in the way you treat your own learning. The loop trains the world to meet you where you habitually stand. That is why the cycle is not just personal failure. It becomes your external reality. One more thing to understand is that the loop manufactures certainty illusions. After several cycles, you will feel certain you are on the right path, because the pattern produced consistent outcomes that fit your desire for moral purity. You confuse this consistency with proof of virtue. It is proof of a pattern. The loop is an efficient machine of confirmation. Now you confront a choice. Keep spinning the loop because it comforts you, or disrupt it with intentional actions that test reality. The next part will be vital because it will show what typically happens when that loop finally reaches a breaking point. It will show the collapse or the awakening that follows. It will help you see what collapse feels like from the inside. That is where most people decide whether to continue the cycle or to begin the hard work of reprogramming. You need to see that tipping moment. I will show it in the next section. The crash or the awakening always looks similar in shape. Something cumulative tilts the system. A series of small losses turns into an emergency, or a single event reveals the full cost of years of waiting. Either way, the person finally notices the arithmetic of their life and cannot pretend any longer. I have watched this many times. The trigger might be a medical bill. It might be an eviction notice. It might be a child's need that cannot wait on guidance. The trigger does not have to be public. Often it is private and brutal. The moment of collapse is the quiet moment when excuses fall away because consequences are immediate. I want you to feel what collapse sounds like from the inside. You will notice a different tone. Shame becomes louder. Regret accelerates. The story that once protected you loses its plausibility. The universe will tell me, stops comforting the stomach. Instead of relief, you feel a raw anxiety that demands action. That is the pivot. At the pivot, you face the bifurcation. One path is to double down on the old script. People choose this because doubling down protects identity. They bury the shock under more ritual. They tell themselves the universe kept them from something worse. That narrative sustains a short-term psychic safety, but it carries a long-term cost, deeper scarcity, and reduced options. The alternative path is rare and difficult. It is the path of noticing and responsibility. The person recognizes the pattern produced the problem. They accept that waiting will not solve an immediate shortfall. They take an action based on facts, not on signs. They become willing to test small bets. That moral pivot, he doubled down on rituals. He refused to apply for temporary work because it didn't feel aligned. The debt grew. He grew resentful of people who acted too soon. The resentment hardened. The crisis deepened. The collapse here meant an eventual insolvency that required more severe intervention. The pathway he chose created a deeper ruin. When the collapse pushes you to act, action alone is not enough. You must reframe how you think about mistakes. If you treat every imperfect choice as catastrophic, you will circle back to waiting. You have to accept that imperfect action is preferable to perfect non-action. Imperfect action yields data. Data yields correction. Correction yields competence. There is another critical component at this stage. Social context either accelerates recovery or prolongs collapse. If your circle shames pragmatic action, you will find it harder to pivot. If your circle praises practical steps, even small ones, your new actions will be reinforced. That is why I insist reprogramming involves not just habit, but relational adjustments. I will give you a short exercise that people who have passed through this stage say help them. It is primitive but effective. It reduces decision friction. The collapse demands quick adaptation. The exercise is this. Pick one urgent financial decision you have been waiting on. Set a one-day deadline. Force yourself to identify 3 facts and 1 immediate action. Then execute the action within 24 hours. No sign checking. No ritual. This will be uncomfortable. That discomfort is the raw material of change. Now understand the emotional terrain post-collapse. There will be grief. You will grieve lost years and lost opportunities. That grief is legitimate. It must be processed. But grief cannot be the roadmap. It must become fuel for action. Too much rumination returns you to the safety of waiting. Grief requires a container, not a permanent residence. I also want to emphasize an ethical shift that collapse often precipitates. Many people tell me after they break the pattern that they felt a new form of humility. It is not the performative humility of virtue signaling. It is the humility of someone who has faced consequence. That humility is practical. It opens you to learning. It loosens the need to be morally superior. That openness is fertile ground for rebuilding competence. Another point is the slow nature of repair. You must be patient with progress. Collapse does not reverse overnight. The new neural pathways of responsibility grow slowly. Each small choice is like a micro-reinvestment. Over months you will see change. Over years you will see a different trajectory. That is why the work requires discipline longer than the initial crisis. I want to offer 2 short transformations I have seen in real lives. The first is Salma. After a severe cash flow crisis, she created a daily practice of executing 1 small revenue-generating action. She tracked it on a simple chart. The first month the total felt negligible. The third month she had a steady flow. The habit rewired her. Waiting became unnatural. Action became default. The second is Aaron. He used the collapse as a reason to seek honest feedback. He asked colleagues to critique his offers. He started pricing experiments and tracked close rates. He learned the skill of negotiation. The collapse detoured him into competence. His income rose not because of mystic timing, but because of deliberate practice. Both stories show a pattern. The collapse forces a choice. If you choose responsibility, you must then sustain small actions. Those actions produce competence. Competence attracts different opportunities. The ecology of your life changes. The world begins to mirror responsibility rather than avoidance. At the same time, I must be blunt. Not everyone chooses responsibility after collapse. Many prefer the temporary sanctity of blame. They say the universe protected them. That story is seductive. It cushions the psyche. It keeps them from facing the labor of repair. The work of rebuilding requires confronting shame and practicing humility. It asks you to accept both risk and accountability. There are practical traps at this stage. One is to replace one avoidance for another. People might stop waiting for signs, but begin to overcheck data to the point of paralysis. This is a sibling problem. The solution is the same. Set tight experiments with deadlines. Action is the antidote to paralysis regardless of the flavor it takes. Another trap is to swing to reckless action. Some, in reaction, become impulsive. Reacting to collapse with reckless risk is not liberation. It is a different form of avoidance. The wiser course is calibrated risk. Small, reversible bets. That is how you rebuild the muscle of responsibility without courting ruin. Now let me close this part with a direct observation. Collapse functions as a severe but honest teacher. It strips away stories. It reveals what your habits actually produce. The question you face in the aftermath is simple but brutal. Will you take responsibility for the habit that produced the collapse? Or will you repackage the habit into a new story and keep doing the same thing? If you choose responsibility, the next step is practice. Reprogramming begins with new habits of decision. That is what I will show next. The practice is simple and repeatable. It is boring in a good way. It asks you to do small things reliably. If you are at the edge right now, that next part is the moment that decides whether the collapse becomes an awakening or a deeper wound. In the next section, I will give you the pattern and the micro-ritual to begin rebuilding. Will you come to the work, or will you find another reason to wait? I will be blunt. If you want to break this habit, the change has to live in clear, repeatable actions. Words alone will not do it. Insight without practice is a theater of virtue. I say this because I have watched so many people feel righteous and then do nothing different. That is the problem I am confronting here. Belief without calibration, faith without rehearsal. The new pattern I ask you to adopt I call responsibility spiritual active. It is a posture more than a slogan. It starts with a shift in the default question you ask when opportunity appears. Most people ask, is this aligned? They mean, will this spare me discomfort? I want you to ask instead, what can I test right now? That linguistic substitution seems small, but it relocates your energy from waiting to probing. It creates permission for imperfect action, and it keeps the experiment small enough to survive failure. I teach a simple practice to build the muscle. When an opportunity arrives, you name 3 concrete facts about it. State numbers, deadlines, deliverables allowed. Then you name 3 immediate steps you could take that would cost little if they fail. Say them out loud. Finally, name 3 realistic outcomes and picture dealing with each one. This is not mysticism. It is rehearsal. It makes the unknown manageable. It narrows the story your mind wants to tell. I have asked people to repeat one sentence to themselves as they do this. I can act with imperfect information and still survive. Say it with me now, silently, or aloud. It is a tiny identity test. Repeating it is not magic. It is conditioning. Each time you repeat, you interrupt the automatic search for cosmic validation and you replace it with experiential data gathering. Start with absurdly small bets. I do not mean ambitionless gestures. I mean reversibility. Call a potential client and ask 2 practical questions. Send a short proposal with a deadline to yourself. Apply for the job and attach your resume in 10 minutes. These are not epical choices. They are probes. The point is not to be right. The point is to produce information. Information is the currency of rebuilding competence. You get better by seeing consequences, not by waiting for permission. Let me put this in a daily structure that is not heavy. For 7 days, pick one decision you have been deferring. It can be a negotiation, a job application, a small investment, a pricing change. Every morning, spend 10 minutes listing the 3 facts, 3 actions, 3 outcomes. Then pick one action and execute it before noon. Track the result. At night, write one sentence about what you learned. That is the ritual. It is boring and effective. You will feel awkward the first week. Your old pattern will try to seduce you back by selling elaborate rituals, by promising more clarity if you just wait. You will resist the discomfort of early failure. Expect shame. Expect a voice telling you are less spiritual because you acted without a sign. That voice is the ego defending the identity that kept you safe. Name it. Thank it. Move anyway. The work is to rewire. He returned to rituals and waited. The difference between Salma and Tom was not luck. It was the willingness to choose and record outcomes. One took responsibility. The other curated excuses. You will need to protect the practice from social pressure. People in your circle may praise your old identity, the patient one, the aligned seeker. They may feel threatened when you begin to act. Expect comments that you are too pragmatic or losing your spiritual edge. These are not arguments. They are social reactions. You must decide whose feedback matters more. If you want to rebuild capacity, choose feedback that rewards attempts, not theatrical virtue. Change your language publicly. When someone asks what you will do about an offer, answer with facts and an action you will take. Say, I have 3 facts about this, and I will do 1 small test tomorrow. That simple phrasing moves the conversation away from aura and into accountability. Others will notice. Over time, your circle will recalibrate. People who act will start to show up in your life. That is how ecosystems shift. The mini ritual I have given you is intentionally mechanical. Rituals work because they lower friction and reduce decision fatigue. But be careful. Ritual without variation becomes ritualistic performance and an easy way back to avoidance. So the practice must include reflection. Every 7 days, review your experiments. Ask, what did I learn? What behaved differently? What bias reemerged? Then adjust the tests. Make them a little bolder each week. Small compounding bets beat eternal waiting. You will also need guardrails to prevent swapping one avoidance for another. People sometimes stop waiting for signs and become data-obsessed to the point of paralysis. To prevent this, enforce time-bound experiments. A rule like 3 facts, 3 actions, 3 outcomes. 1 action executed within 24 hours is designed to be invasive enough to outrun analysis. It forces commitment. It creates the experience of survival under uncertainty. That experience is the engine of identity change. Part of responsible reprogramming is learning to reframe mistakes. You must accept that some experiments will fail. When they do, use a predictable template to process the failure. Name 1 fact you misread. Name 1 adjustment. Pick 1 corrective action. Do not moralize the failure. Say, I tested X, it failed in Y way. I will change Z. That kind of neutral, action-oriented debrief prevents shame from calcifying back into paralysis. I give you 2 short phrases to practice after each experiment. Say to yourself, this was an experiment, not a verdict. And I am building skill, not proving a story. These sentences re-anchor you to process over identity. Repeat them. They are small cognitive tools that blunt the urge to rewrite failure into proof of a grand narrative about your spiritual purity or destiny. You will notice something curious. As you act more, your real intuition sharpens. Not the vague, performance-oriented signal you used to chase, but a practical sense about who to call, what price to test, what language works in a proposal. That practical intuition grows like a muscle. It does not ask for cosmic confirmation because it is informed by repeated microfeedback. Your internal compass becomes calibrated by outcomes rather than by wishes. There is a social piece to this work that you cannot skip. If your closest friends or mentors reward ritualized waiting, you will stall. You need allies who appreciate action. Seek them deliberately. Ask 1 honest person to be a reality check. Tell them you will report your weekly experiments and ask for blunt feedback. That accountability reduces the probability you will self-handicap with noble excuses. Finally, the hardest part is integrating this into identity. You will have to rewrite the story you tell about yourself. Instead of, I wait for the universe, start telling a new story. I test the world and refine my offers. Practice saying it in the present tense. The mind will resist this because identity feels safer than action. But identity is not fixed. Every experiment is an identity test. Each successful small act gives you permission to expand who you believe you can be. If you commit, the next part will show what life looks like when that commitment compounds. The scenes are quiet at first, but relentless in their effect. You will see how traction appears, how the social field shifts, and how your financial reality begins to reflect different choices. I will lay out those scenes next, so you can imagine the concrete distance between waiting and acting. Are you ready to see what responsibility actually generates? When people ask me what a different life looks like, I do not describe miracles. I describe daily facts shifting. I describe meetings that happen because you answered the phone. I describe bank balances that move because you sent invoices on time. The future I want you to picture is a sequence of small, predictable wins stacked across months. That is what change looks like when practice meets patience. The first visible shift is speed. Opportunities that require quick response no longer slip past you. You begin to reply to proposals within a day. You apply for roles the moment they appear. You put offers in front of people instead of waiting for permission. Speed compounds in markets where timing matters. When many people wait for signs, the first movers get the better terms. Acting increases your bargaining space. This is ordinary advantage, not mystical. Alongside speed, your decision tone changes. Decisions feel less dramatic. They become notices and amendments rather than destiny-altering verdicts. When you adopt the exercise I taught, your mind replaces catastrophic narratives with corrective ones. You stop equating a single failure with identity collapse. That frees you to test pricing, to negotiate, to ask for deposits. Each small negotiation that ends well raises your expectation of acceptable outcomes. Your status in your market changes as a result. I want you to imagine a morning that used to paralyze you. Before, a promising client email would trigger hours of rumination. You would check social feeds for signs, consult friends, maybe do a ritual. Now, you read the message, write down the facts, and set a time to propose terms. You ask 2 clarifying questions. You propose 3 options. You schedule the call. The client sees someone who moves and responds. That credibility alone opens doors to different deals. Financially, the effects are visible but slow. I am not promising overnight wealth. I am promising trajectory change. Salma's case illustrates this. The short-term contract became a steady retainer because she started sending follow-ups and packaging small wins into larger offers. Her monthly income moved from unpredictable gigs into a predictable base plus growth. That predictability allowed her to plan, to save, to invest in skills. Small actions created a foundation where before there had been fragility. You will also notice relational shifts. People who were attracted to your waiting, the ones who praised depth over action, will lose influence. New people will appear, decisive colleagues, collaborators who appreciate timelines, mentors who are interested in results. This social recalibration is not about abandoning long-standing friends. It is about enlarging your professional ecology. You do not need permission to choose who you spend time with. There is a subtler shift in how the world signals to you. When your posture becomes responsible, the signals you notice change. You start seeing pattern in proposals rather than superstition in coincidences. You recognize a genuine market trend instead of a comforting omen. This is not a loss of spiritual sensitivity. It is its refinement. Your intuition becomes a partner to evidence, not a substitute for it. I want you to picture 2 weeks in this new mode. Week 1, you run 3 small experiments. 2 succeed, 1 fails. You record outcomes and adjust. Week 2, you renegotiate a rate based on the learning from the successful experiments. A client agrees. Your income increases modestly. You feel less anxious about money. That lowered anxiety produces clearer thinking, which yields better choices. The loop flips from scarcity to competence. This pattern also protects you from predators and bad deals. Waiting for signs often masquerades as moral superiority, which can leave you vulnerable to people who use spiritual language to exploit hesitation. Acting with clarity provides a different armor. You can read terms, set boundaries, and refuse politely. That refusal is not fear. It is discernment. Pricing is a signal to the market about value. When you refuse to undercharge out of a moral excuse, you start to attract different clients. I will tell you a story of deliberate rebuilding. Aaron was adrift after a prolonged period of waiting. He had ideas but no rhythm. He began by doing one small thing each morning. Reach out to one contact, send one draft offer, ask for one piece of feedback. He tracked replies and revised his messaging. Within 4 months, he had a repeatable sales pitch and a reliable close rate. His income did not triple overnight, but it became predictable enough to cover costs and then expand. The pattern was simple: consistent action, recording, revision. Over time, the noise of rituals quieted and competence spoke. You will notice another change. Your inner language gets cleaner. You stop telling stories that paint you as a passive saint. You begin to say things like, "I tried X and learned Y." This empirical language becomes habitual. It keeps you from reinventing failure into a mystical lesson, and it keeps you oriented toward repair. That is practical humility. It is not performative. It is the humility born from consequence. The future alternates between patience and impatience. You must be patient with the neural rewiring. You must be impatient about repeating old behaviors. This paradox is the work. You are gentle with yourself when you slip and relentless in returning to experiments. The daily discipline of tiny bets is how patience and impatience coexist productively. Eventually, the life you build will attract different offers. People want people who deliver. Markets clear for those who act. The universe you use to petition with ceremonies will begin to present you with practical signals. People who need your skill, partners who respect your timeline, clients willing to pay. That is the pragmatic manifestation of co-creation. You are doing the work the universe expects of you. If you are imagining resistance now, that is good. Resistances are material. They are a map. In the final part, one will ask you to hold a mirror to your pattern and commit to one immediate step. That step will be small. It will be doable. It will be the hinge between this imagining and your first week of change. Prepare yourself to answer one question with clarity. The choice you make there will determine whether this future remains a concept or becomes your life. We come to the end, and I will not soften the truth. You can live a long life believing the universe owes you clear signs, and you can watch opportunities pass like trains at a station you refuse to board. Or you can take responsibility and turn signals into action. Both roads are morally defensible in someone's narrative. Both produce different realities. Which one do you want? Here is the thesis again, in plain terms. People who ask for signs often do so to avoid the discomfort of decision. That avoidance protects identity but costs time, income, and options. The habit organizes experiences to confirm itself. That is not coincidence. It is coherent patterning. If you want different results, change the pattern. Choose small, disciplined experiments over theatrical waiting. Ask yourself where you are in the loop right now. Are you primarily in preparation mode, gathering spiritual credentials and waiting for clarity? Are you the person who interprets only confirming signs and ignores counter-evidence? Are you a professional preparer always ready but never launched? Or are you spiraling toward collapse, waiting for a sign to rescue you? Name it silently. Naming is the first act of responsibility. Now I will give you one micro step you can do immediately. It is designed to be unsexy and effective. Pick one unresolved financial decision you have avoided. Spend 10 minutes now listing 3 facts about it. Then write 3 actions you could take in the next 24 hours. Choose the smallest one and do it. That is the act. No ritual. No waiting. If you want, tell someone you will do it and report back. This single movement may feel trivial. It is not. It is the first data point in a new life. I ask you to also consider a short promise to yourself, formulated in first person. State it now. I will run one 24-hour experiment this week. Repeat it twice. Say aloud, I choose responsibility today. This verbal contract is both tiny and binding. It colors the week. It puts the mind on notice that identity will be tested by behavior, not by belief. You will fear two traps as you begin. One is swinging from waiting to recklessness. Do not confuse boldness with impulse. Calibrate risks so that bets are small and reversible. The other trap is the covert substitution of one avoidance for another, where you replace spiritual waiting with endless research. Time box your experiments. Set deadlines. Accountability is the antidote. There is another practical recommendation. Keep a simple ledger of experiments. For each one, record the date, the action, the hypothesis, and the outcome. That ledger becomes proof you can hold when old narratives resurface. Over months, it becomes an identity archive. You will look back and see a map of incremental competence. That visual proof will be harder for your mind to ignore than any sign. You should also consider the company you keep. If the people around you valorize waiting and ritualize inaction, you will need to rebalance your social diet. That may mean creating a small cohort of practitioners. You do not need to cut everyone out. You need a few anchors who will speak truth when you flinch. Choose them carefully. Ask them for blunt feedback about your experiments. I do not promise an absence of grief. You will mourn the years you gave away to waiting. That grief is real and deserved. But grieving is not the end point. Use grief as the fuel for action. Convert regret into a practical decision. The next missed opportunity will be a lesson, not a rule. This is how people who remake themselves behave. They move with sorrow, but not with paralysis. If you are honest with yourself, you know what the next day could look like. It could be like yesterday, full of polite rituals and postponed calls. Or it could be a day where you pick an action and execute. This is the scale of agency. The distance between these two mornings is not metaphysical. It is procedural. It is habit layered upon habit. Before I close, I will mirror you directly. If you have watched to this point and felt anger, that anger is useful. It means your pattern has cost you. If you feel shame, use it diagnostically. Shame wants to hide. Use it to point to a single corrective action. If you feel relief, good. Use relief to start. If you feel defensive, fine. Write down the defense and then do the micro step anyway. The final practical challenge I leave you with is simple and immediate. In the next 48 hours, choose a financial decision you have been waiting on and execute one small test. Do not seek a sign. Choose based on facts you can observe. Act, then log the result. If you do this, you will have began to change the data inside your head. If you do not, nothing changes. That is the cost of staying the same. Thank you for staying with this uncomfortable mirror. If you want to keep going, tell me in the comments what experiment you will run this week and where you are from. Tell me the city and the one action. That public statement will increase the odds you move. That is a small social hack for accountability. If you promised yourself to act, go now and do the small thing. The universe will not send a clearer sign than your own movement. A closing sentence to carry. I will act imperfectly, learn quickly, and rebuild my competence. Repeat it once. Keep it simple. Then do one small thing.